This week on Just Solutions, housing and employment discrimination, as well as massive wealth and opportunity gaps, show that racism and discrimination continue to choke economic opportunity for African Americans at nearly every turn. Folklorist, writer and lecturer Kirsten Mullen tackles these issues head-on and makes the case for economic reparations for US descendants of slavery in a new book she's co-authored, From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. From Free Speech TV, Just Solutions. Well, Kirsten, it's great to have you with us. And as we're talking this week, President Joe Biden is in Tulsa, Oklahoma to mark the centenary of the Greenwood Massacre. And the conversation around reparations is once again in the spotlight. But this is a historic conversation that goes back to the founding of the Republic. And in your new book, you really lay out the history of reparations. But you also say that so many people want this to stay in the history books and view this as something that is ancient history and therefore cannot be addressed in modern times. You yourself, Kirsten, are the great-granddaughter of somebody who was born into slavery. So this isn't ancient history. And as we're going to find out, the repercussions, particularly the economic repercussions, are still very much with us. Take us through some of the history around reparations. And I think many people might know the 40 acres and a mule, but not necessarily know what happened next. So take us back to that.
Thank you so much, Maeve. I'd like to say, first of all, that it is extraordinary that President Biden talked about what happened in Tulsa. To my memory, he is the first American president to actually admit that the destruction of a Black community happened, that it was wrong, and that there were governmental officials who were involved in that massacre. That is an unprecedented admission, and I think it's really important that he did so. But you're right, reparations is a conversation that has been happening, especially in the Black community, probably from the moment that the first Black person was forced to come to this state, to this country, and to labor without compensation. My co-author, William Darity, and I like to say that, the enslaved people were the first abolitionists. They were always trying to find ways to get compensated for their labor, but also to free themselves from enslavement. So early on, you had people like Callie House, who herself had been enslaved, who was seeking initially pensions for the Union officers, the Union soldiers who had been Black people, men and women. And she then thought, well, slavery is something that has effects that people are still experiencing, and the federal government should pay for that. And so she created an organization that ultimately had over 300,000 paid members who were interested in, understanding how the federal government might provide repair to them for their and their ancestors' years of being enslaved. You had people like Queen Mother Audley Moore, who petitioned the United Nations, in the back half of the 20th century, and she focused on, as did Callie House, Black American descendants of U.S. slavery as the eligible recipients for reparations. Callie House and Audley Moore, sort of kind of a direct linkage, those two individuals. You had people like Robert Johnson, who was a proponent of the Black Manifesto, who was targeting communities of faith as the potential, the potential sources of a reparations super fund. And he actually did have some success. It was very minimal. I think he was asking $500 million and received maybe 1% of that, which actually did go to help create a Black think tank that created some of the first data that we have on the destruction of Black communities at the hands of these white mobsters.
You're a folklorist, Kirsten, and so you speak in stories. You know the importance of stories and folklore. We've been talking about the erasure of history and the deliberate suppression of these stories when it comes to what happened in Tulsa, what happened in Wilmington. Of course, you're in North Carolina, and the countless other massacres, let alone the realities of slavery. This is happening while we're seeing legislation being introduced and passed to stop things like critical race theory from being discussed in public schools, so further erasing those stories. What role do stories and an understanding of history, what role does that play when we're talking about reparations? Because so many white Americans, as you said, reparations have been having, conversations have been had amongst the Black community, but white Americans don't know anything about this. They don't even understand their own history, their own wealth, and its connection to, say, the Homestead Act, and how white families' wealth in many ways is built on the backs of Black families. So take us through the role of stories, of folklore, of history in helping us understand what's happening and the need for reparations.
When we were writing From Here to Equality, I had frequent opportunities to talk with friends and other writers about the work we were doing. And I can remember sharing one passage with an individual who, I thought was, fairly well versed in this subject matter. But yet she said, this is really unfamiliar to me and I need you to kind of break it down. And I asked her, what would be really helpful? And she said, I need a story. And as it happened, I had just interviewed Hortense McClinton, who appears in our book. She is 102 years old, very much alive, and she is the daughter of an enslaved person. Her father, Seabrone Jones King, was born into slavery. Now, he was an infant when slavery ended, but he was, in fact, born a slave. So when you think about generations, generational distance from slavery, she is one generation away and is very much informed about the kinds of struggles that her family experienced. She told us about how they were, this is before she was born, the family was living in East Texas, in Kilgore, Texas, and her family was very fortunate to own land that was rich in timber. And her father had a lumber mill on his property and employed several people to help him harvest this timber, which he then turned around and sold at market. And one of the stories that she told was about how he had his hands deliver a load of lumber to the train station to be shipped to a buyer, and how the white dispatcher took exception to these Black people coming, with this lumber to be loaded for this their Black boss. And he refused. And so King himself comes down to the train station with his pistol, and he, confronts the man. And the guy says to him, I'm gonna shoot you. I'm not gonna allow this wood to be loaded on my train. And King supposedly said, well, you better shoot me fast, because I will have shot you before I hit the ground, and we'll both be dead. And the dispatcher backed away, and the lumber was loaded, but Seabrone Jones King's family said to him, all right, you managed, you succeeded in this instance, but we need to get you and your family out of Texas. And so they moved to Boley, Oklahoma, one of the all Black towns, which is where our consultant, Hortense McClinton, herself was born. So these stories help to put a face, a name, on these realities. We can see ourselves oftentimes in these individuals, and certainly we can understand their motivations better when we know more about what compelled them to act in the ways that they did. I think the other thing that stories help us to do is to see comparisons in our present day lives. Certainly there are individuals who have heard us talk about the decades of white mob violence that was targeted at Black people, that not only caused injuries and deaths, but also often resulted in the confiscation and appropriation of Black land. And this is something that's happening today. We can connect the dots and say, oh, is that what happened to this community that's near, my residence, where Black people were thrown off their land or did not receive market value for their land? So the stories, help us to remember these events, but they also help us to identify elements of those stories that resonate in the present.
It does seem, though, that the stories that do dominate are a fictitious version of reality. I mean, when we talk about the American dream and people can come here and work hard and succeed, and that's why so many people come to America, there's no conversation about the systemic injustices and inequalities that prohibit so many people from gaining those opportunities, and that disproportionately benefit some communities. I mean, I mentioned the Homestead Act, and so many white families' wealth is built on the fact that their families were given land.
Yes. I mean, we say that, when you migrate to a country, you migrate to its history and to its obligations. And shame on you if you don't do that research. We think it's very much likely that immigrants to the US, Black and white, are coming here because of what they see on the ground. They're coming here because of the infrastructure. They're coming here because of the job opportunities, because of the parks, because of the recreation opportunities, because of the education opportunities, all of which were created on the backs of this free labor force, slavery, which we, think of as the original affirmative action for white people. But you mentioned the Homestead Acts. And so, yes, this is something very important to talk about. At the end of the Civil War, you had a situation in which the federal government promised and then reneged on its promise to give Black households 40 acres of land that they could either own free and clear or possibly purchase at below market values in order to give them a leg up, to give them something to start their lives as free people. This was the beginning of that first step to help them to achieve full citizenship. So Black people are, these are newly emancipated enslaved people, are promised 40-acre land grants, but then they are pulled back from them. A small number of families were actually located on about 40,000 acres of land. But then that's reversed, after Abraham Lincoln is assassinated and Andrew Johnson becomes president. At the same time, though, we have white Americans, including recent immigrants from Europe, benefiting from the Homestead Acts. And this is beginning in 1862. The Homestead Acts provided 160-acre land grants in the Western territories. So this is, basically a project that is completing the U.S.'s sort of national territorial project. These are lands that only recently had been occupied by Native American people and tribes. Now, the land that was promised to the newly enslaved Black people was land along the southern band of the United States, from the Sea Islands of South Carolina all the way across to the St. Johns River of Florida. These were lands that had recently been confiscated and abandoned by the Confederates. So two different circumstances. But yes, we know that about 1.5 million white families took advantage of the Homestead Act, and that translates to 45 million households today that are still reaping the benefits of this single federal mandate. Something like about 50 million acres of land in total were given basically to white Americans. Now, to give you an idea of what that kind of land mass would be, 250 acres of land is the equivalent of all of Washington State, Oregon, California, Nevada, and Massachusetts combined, or put differently, all of Texas and all of California combined. It's a huge land mass. And this is property that they could live on themselves. You could grow crops on it. If there's lumber on it or wildlife on it, that was yours to keep or to sell. You could lease the land. You could use it as collateral for a loan for a business. You could use it to send your children to college and have them emerge debt-free. And this is exactly what white people did with that land. And then importantly, you could bequeath the land itself or the profits from the land to your offspring, which they could in turn do and build wealth over the generations. One of our colleagues, Jennifer Mueller, has talked about how in one of her classes, she instructed her students to investigate their own wealth positions. And the students in one of her classes, like 150 students, 50 of those students were Black or of color. And of the 100 white students, something like a third of them discovered a Homestead Act land patent in their families. Of those 50 students who were non-white, 12 or 13 of them were Black students. None of them had a Homestead Act patent in their own family's history that they could unearth. So remember one of the stories that she shared of one of the white students whose family had a Homestead Act land patent. This was 1880, and the family was in the Texas Panhandle. So the student's grandfather was the recipient of a Homestead Act land grant, and they leased the land. All right, so they're receiving an income stream from the land, and then when the grandfather dies, his widow and their 8 children moved to Austin, Texas, to give the children a better opportunity, to go to college. 6 of the 8 go to college, receive a college degree, and then the mother dies, the widow dies, and the children decide to continue to lease the land and to divide the profits from the lease 8 ways. Then natural gas is discovered on the land in 1980. So full 100 years later, natural gas has been discovered on the land. And it turns out to be one of the largest such deposits in the area. And the first year they receive $100,000 in revenue from that natural gas deposit. So it's almost like they were receiving, a monthly dividend check, from the federal government. So you have, white Americans, many of whom are not aware that this government largesse was in their family's history. But they are continuing to reap the benefits of this federal program. You've got the federal government investing in white people's wealth and disinvesting in Black people's wealth. That was what was happening in the 19th century. But in the 20th century, the way the federal government advantaged white Americans was through home ownership. So no longer land ownership per se, but home ownership. And this was done through the Federal Housing Authority and the GI Bill. And, veterans are returning to the States. They are needing assistance readjusting to life as civilians. How many jobs are available to them? You've got a situation where, women had stepped in a lot of cases and taken those jobs because so many of the men had been drafted in the war, but now they're back. So the government decides to create opportunities for these veterans to go to college and university. And tuitions are paid, they received stipends, but they also received assistance buying houses. So up until this time, the early 40s, home ownership was really something that was available to wealthy Americans, Black and white. Americans were renters. But now it's possible to purchase a house with a low or no down payment, to have really low subsidized interest rates. And you have a large number of white Americans who are able to take advantage of the GI Bill. Black Americans, not so much. One of our colleagues, Ira Katz Nelson, who wrote a fabulous book called When Affirmative Action Was White, documents how in Mississippi, in one year, over 3,000 white Americans received the GI Bill that enabled them to invest in farms, businesses, or homes. And two Black Americans, were able to do so. So over 3,000 white GIs and 2 Black Americans. And this was because part of the agreement to have the legislation pass included the Southern legislators' insistence that the administration of the GI Bill not be a national program function, but that the states, these counties, be allowed to administer the program as they saw fit. And what they saw fit to do in large measure was to maintain their social order, to maintain their lifestyles. And that meant disadvantaging Black GIs and their families.
Well, in your book, you bring the conversation right up to present day inequality and the resource gap, the wealth gap that we're seeing between Black Americans and white Americans. And you argue that closing the wealth gap should be at the heart of a reparations program. And that would look like direct financial payments from the federal government. And I think this would be about at least $11 trillion. So take us through that. Why direct payments is needed, and compare that to maybe other forms of reparations that we've seen. The German government after World War II, what happened with Japanese Americans after World War II as well. Why direct payments and its connection to other reparations programs?
Certainly. First, I want to say, the racial wealth gap, we believe, is the best indicator that we have found for the cumulative intergenerational effects of, these governmental policies, in this country. Black people constitute about 12% of the American population, yet they possess less than 12% of the nation's wealth. So to bring the Black wealth into consistency with the Black's representation in the population would require at least $11 trillion or $850,000 per household. So the federal government, in so much as the federal government sanctioned slavery, and after the Civil War ended, promised and then denied the recent emancipated Black population these 40-acre land grants, while making 250 million acres of land available to white Americans. We believe that this absolutely is the way to go. Direct payments make it possible for individuals to make their own decisions about how those funds will be spent. A number of folks have talked about, social programs or racial equity programs as a remedy. But the difficulty there is, how are these programs going to eliminate the racial wealth gap? I mean, that is for us the central goal of a reparations initiative. Scholarships are a good thing, but everyone is not, in a position to take advantage of going to school. Some people have already been to college. Others are not of an age where that's a reasonable thing for them to do. But the education itself is not going to dramatically or even significantly affect the racial wealth gap. People talk about, reversing redlining or housing voucher programs like the one that Evanston, Illinois recently passed. I mean, this is basically a racial equity initiative. It's not a reparations program, in part because it's so narrowly targeted to individuals who were disadvantaged, in Evanston's case, by the city government in the housing market. The Evanston program is not going to help Black people in Chicago. It's not going to help Black people in Florida. It's a very narrowly targeted program that hopefully will garner some goodwill for the city of Evanston, but it's not going to move the needle on the racial wealth gap. You mentioned Germany and Germany's reparations program. Yes, absolutely. Germany's reparations for the Holocaust victims were largely in the form of direct payments to those individuals, as it should be. They were given full discretion of those funds. Likewise, when the United States decided that it would remunerate Japanese Americans who it had wrongfully interned during World War II, direct payments, uniform direct payments in this case, to every individual who had been interned was the route that was taken. When you look at the 9/11 terror attack situation, the special agent for special master was the title, who made the decision about who would receive those funds and how much, also decided that direct payments to the victims was the way to go. So, this is a time-honored approach that has worked all around the world, and we think it's exactly the approach that should be taken in the case of Black American descendants of U.S. slavery.
Well, we just have a few minutes, Kirsten, and I do want to talk about what's happening with the HR 40. But just to clarify, what you're calling for in terms of reparations, you say that it's the federal government that needs to pay this. But if we look at the corporations, the universities, the institutions that have also generated and continue to generate their wealth as a result of slavery, what role do they have to play in this?
So we would hope that they would use their reputation, their muscle, their influence to lobby and petition Congress for a full reparations program for Black descendants of U.S. slavery. If they are willing and interested in creating racial equity initiatives on their own, we certainly think that's a great idea, but it's not going to replace this the importance of a national program. I think in some ways we minimize this notion of $11 trillion. We did some calculations on the back of an envelope, and if a group were to contribute $1 billion a month to a reparations fund, so that would be $12 billion per annum, it would take 830 years to reach $11 trillion. It's not a trivial sum. The federal government is the capable party. The federal government is also the only party that can pay this bill. And we think, in order to transform this country and to make Black American descendants of U.S. slavery full citizens of this country, the federal government is the actor that needs to make this happen.
Well, we just have a couple of minutes left, but HR 40 is out there as a piece of legislation around reparations. This would essentially create a commission that would offer recommendations. This is not a reparations program by any stretch. So what are your thoughts very briefly on HR 40?
So there are two kinds of problems that we see with HR 40. There are four major pieces that are missing. So HR 40 does not identify the eligible recipients of reparations. And for us, these are individuals who would meet two standards, a lineage standard and an identity standard. So these are individuals who can prove that they are descended from at least one person who was enslaved in the United States. And also 12 years prior to the creation of a reparations program or the enactment of a reparations commission, self-identified as Black, African American, Afro-American, or Negro. HR 40 does not target the elimination of the racial wealth gap as its goal. It does not say this $11 trillion should be distributed to Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. HR 40 does not specify that payments should be made directly to individuals. So not to some authority that's going to manage the funds on their behalf, not to education programs, not to community level initiatives that may or may not advantage the intended recipients, but direct payments to those individuals. And HR 40 also does not specify the federal government is the culpable party, that it should pay reparations, and that there are very good reasons for that. There are also some problems with the way the committee itself is structured. It's a huge committee, a huge commission. Now it's ballooned from 7 members, as was originally designated, to 15. They can receive salaries of up to $172,000 per year as a consequence of executive level 4 salaries that are specified in the bill, which we think is really problematic. In most commissions of this type, the members serve gratis. Certainly their expenses are covered and the administrative staff is paid, but we view this as a sacred mission and don't believe that they should be paid. The length of time that the commission could operate has been extended in the last iteration of the bill. A quorum is set at 7 members, not even a majority. So 15 members, but only 7 are required to have a majority. The director of the administrative director is not someone who would be a member of the commission, but someone who would be appointed. That individual is given the opportunity to select 6 of the 15, which we think is interesting. So if there were an issue to be voted on and the director had the support of those 6, he or she only would need one other person to conduct business. They've asked to be excluded from the legislation that requires such commissions to operate in the sunshine. So they have requested permission to forego public meetings, public involvement, public hearings, to make available to the public their transcripts, their minutes, etc. So it's just a really odd kind of configuration. Typically, commissions of this type go out of their way to be transparent. Oftentimes they include members of Congress on the Senate and the House side on the commission itself. This commission has specified that those people may not serve. No government employees at any level, no mayors, no governors, no cabinet members may serve. And we think part of this reason may be because those individuals legally cannot be paid. Whoever did the writing on this commission wants to make sure that that they get paid. Reparations for Black Americans of U.S. slavery may or may not happen, but if if this commission is created, those individuals will get their reparations. We just think it's just an odd, the way the bill has evolved has not been for the good, and we just don't think that it's going to deliver the kind of directive that we would wish that commission to have to deliver true reparations.
Well, Kirsten Mullen has been our guest today. From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. Thank you so much for being with us.
Pleasure.
And join us next week on Just Solutions. We'll continue our discussion on our dive into what's happening with the racial wealth gap. That's next week. Same time, same place, right here. Free Speech TV, Just Solutions.